Anybody who gets these notices, it's shattering.
I had to have a really soul searching. Like, is this what I really should be doing? Right? Maybe this is worthless.
We're like deers in the headlight because we don't know how to pivot. We're acutely aware of what we're losing and whether we'll ever be able to bring it back again.
I'm Gemma Ware, and you're listening to the Conversation Weekly, The World Explained by Experts. This week, what it's like to be a scientist whose grant funding has been terminated by the Trump administration. I'm joined today by Alla Katz-Nelson, who's Associate Health Editor at The Conversation in the US, based in Massachusetts. Alla, it's great to have you on the show. Welcome.
Thank you. So great to talk to you today.
So it seems every day right now there's a new headline about the Trump administration's battle with American universities. Give us an overview. What's been happening in the first 100 days of Trump's new presidency?
Right. There's a lot to know, and it's really changing day by day. Since President Trump took office in January, there have been several massive hits on research at universities. And I'd say there are two big pieces here driving the administration's actions. One piece relates to what the government claims is an effort to root out anti-Semitism on campus. So the administration has said that universities did not do enough to protect Jewish students during the widespread campus protests relating to the war in Gaza. And it's therefore targeting multiple universities for cuts to federal funding.
Columbia University will in fact give in to demands from the Trump administration in order to restore hundreds of millions of dollars in federal funding.
Harvard University is now suing the Trump administration over the administration's threats to cut billions of dollars from the university's funding. It's the latest escalation in the showdown between Harvard and the Trump administration.
The administration has revoked the visas of more than 1,600 international students, ostensibly because of their activities along these lines.
As President Donald Trump's administration slashes federal university funding, including canceling foreign student visas, American and international students in the U.S. are searching for alternatives.
Although it did say in late April that it was restoring those visas. So the other element in play is the administration's attack on university programs and research that relate to diversity, equity, and inclusion, generally abbreviated as DEI. So that has led to massive cuts in funding that have been targeted to specific research areas. So projects, for example, that study health issues in specific populations. And it's also hit training programs and support programs for academics from underrepresented groups. And the effect of both of these lines of attack has been pretty severe. So the administration has said it's investigating 60 universities for anti-Semitic discrimination, and it's also investigating more than 50 universities for DEI activities, which it says are also discriminatory.
The funding, freezing, and chaos has to stop now.
Research, careers, education, and lives on the line with massive funding cuts to medical research.
Meanwhile, the Trump administration is using its control of federal funding agencies, most significantly the National Institutes of Health, the NIH, to influence the flow of research dollars. What's been happening specifically at the NIH in the past few months?
Yeah, so the tally so far there is that almost 800 NIH grants have been canceled. And those cancellations have largely focused on specific topics. And there's very much been a keywords approach here. As one of his first acts in office this term, President Trump issued an executive order essentially proclaiming any activities relating to diversity, equity, and inclusion verboten at universities that receive federal funding. So the administration came out with a list of words that it planned to root out. And that's where it's focused on eliminating NIH grants. For example, research on trans health has been heavily cut, as well as research relating to HIV. There's also been widespread cuts to research relating to COVID-19, which the administration no longer sees as relevant. Health effects of climate change have been another area that's taken a hit, and also vaccine hesitancy. But really, there's been cancellations across very many research areas. And then in April, NIH announced a more general prohibition, saying it wouldn't award grants at all to institutions with DEI programs. And I think another striking recent event is that in April, It was revealed that NIH would cease communicating with a handful of schools, even to tell them whether or why their funds were being frozen.
That's just really hard to not know what's going on with your grants. At the same time, another federal funding agency, the National Science Foundation, the NSF, has also had its $9 billion budget threatened, and some grants, such as those researching online disinformation, have been terminated. So this goes beyond just the National Institutes of Health. This is broader than that.
For sure, the administration is squeezing science from all sides, and actually scientists in academia have expressed deep concerns about the long-term safety and stability, you could say, of the research enterprise in the country.
The Trump administration is waging a, quote, wholesale assault on U.S. science, an effort that threatens the country's health, economic development, national security, and scientific preeminence. That's according to an open letter published today by nearly 2,000 doctors, scientists, and researchers.
And there are already signs that researchers are looking for stability by seeking opportunities to move their labs outside the U.S. And we are still very much in the midst of this upheaval. A memo that was leaked in mid-April noted plans to cut NIH funding by $20 billion, which is a whopping 40% cut. That would be a huge deal. On the plus side, though, legal challenges are mounting. So, for example, back in February, a judge blocked the NIH's plan to implement a 15% cap on what's called indirect costs in grants, which cover institutional and basic maintenance things that are actually very foundational for grants to function. Several states and universities have also sued the administration, saying that grant cancellations didn't follow proper procedures. So we're kind of waiting to see how all that plays out. Overall, though, one thing I found really striking is how hard it is to follow what is actually happening. So even if legal challenges are being upheld in court, it's not really clear that actions are being reversed. So there's this kind of general sense of chaos.
We're now going to hear from some scientists caught up in that chaos, affected by cuts and suspensions to their research funding. So, Alla, thank you very much for walking us through what's been happening as much as you can.
Thanks for having me.
Can you please just tell me your full name and how you'd like us to refer to you, like the position you have and what you do?
Sure. My name is Singhi Lee. I'm a research professor at the University of Michigan. So you can call me just Sunghee.
Sunghee.
That sounds perfect for me.
Singhi Lee studies populations. She looks at the best ways to sample smaller groups within large groups of people.
I specialize in methodologies for how to represent subgroups that are small for various reasons. And those subgroups so far that I have looked at includes racial, ethnic, linguistic, and sexual minorities.
In 2024, Singhi was awarded a $5 million 5-year grant from the NIH. The project was looking at different risk factors for Alzheimer's disease across racial and ethnic minorities in the US. Part of the problem she was trying to address was that previous studies had focused mainly on collecting data in English and Spanish.
So basically, my study tried to fill that gap. How best can we study the remaining groups so that we can look at everybody in the population? So everything we did was in English, Spanish, Chinese, Korean, and Vietnamese. So our study actually looked at everybody. But in doing so, we oversample the groups that have been traditionally lacking statistical powers or unintentionally excluded because they don't have the proper language proficiency.
And Alzheimer's obviously huge societal problem, huge health problem, huge burden on many, many families. So really important to do this research.
Yes. So I believe at the moment there are almost 7 million Americans living with Alzheimer's disease. And by 2050, it's supposed to a minimum double or more. And in 2050, the Alzheimer's disease is going to cost the society $1 trillion in today's dollar. So yeah, it's a really expensive, but also just really difficult disease for, like you said, not only patients, but also their families.
Was this the first NIH grant that you'd ever received?
It is not. I have received a couple other grants, which actually led to developing the innovation proposed as part of this study. So this study is a reflection of 20-some years of my research career. as well as a few grants from NIH that fostered the development of the idea that we are trying to implement in this study.
In the first few months of 2025, Sunghee and her team of co-investigators, research assistants, programmers, and graduate students were designing the cognitive assessment tools they'd be using to test for risk factors for Alzheimer's, and translating it all into their 5 languages. Their goal was to start collecting data this summer. Take me back to the moment when you first found out that something was wrong with this grant.
So I will never forget March 21st of this year. This was a Friday. I was in a meeting on a project completely unrelated to this. I received an email from our Office of Research, who forwarded an email from NIH. And the email notified that the grant was terminated. It was very short and opaque, which is very different than how NIH usually operates. One of the reasons why NIH and their grant process is so highly respected is because of the transparency. Just to give you the sense of what was written in that letter, it cited DEI studies being a reason for termination. And because apparently DEI studies are no longer, exact wording from the letter, effectuates agency priorities. It was really confusing for 2 reasons. One, like I described, we study everybody. So if looking at everybody is a DEI study, just about any data collection in this country should be classified as DEI studies and terminated, right? Another reason was they didn't really disclose what the agency priorities are. So all that is left to our own imagination to understand what that letter actually meant.
This just came completely out of the blue, or had you had any warning?
Nothing at all. Just out of blue. We had one study terminated a couple hours before I got the termination letter for my study, and that was a training grant for a doctoral student in our program. That one looks at sexual minorities. So we kind of had a suspicion something might happen with that study, but this study, again, looks at everybody, so it was just completely unexpected.
What did you do next?
It was a stop work order, so I had to communicate with the team right away because that was the last day we could spend any effort for this project. So I had to communicate, and it was extremely hard, but I'm letting you know we have to stop all the work that we've been doing on this project.
Do you have an understanding of why you think the grant was terminated?
So that's an interesting part. I have no idea. So I can only speculate.
Yeah.
Right? If anybody read an abstract of this study, and if anybody had a scientific understanding of any science, they would have known that this is not a DEI study. However they define DEI studies, they would have known this is not. So I question how they identified studies to terminate, right? Which again, they don't disclose, so I don't know what went in. So a couple speculations that people have made, not necessarily me, but people who knew about this made. The study title includes Latinx instead of Latino. And perhaps Latinx is a word that one shouldn't be using. That's the only thing that I can really think of why this was identified as a DEI study. Because again, if you read anything, you will notice it's not. We're simply oversampling certain groups. Because other groups do not need to be oversampled because we have enough statistical power already. So we don't need to. So that's the only reason.
Each year, the University of Michigan system, which has 3 campuses across the state, spends a little over $2 billion on research. More than half of that, $1.17 billion, comes in through federal research grants, with $762 million of that amount coming from the NIH.
It's not just the research faculty at the university who need this funding, it's supporting the careers of many other staff and students at the university as well when you bring in one of these proposals.
Brady West is a colleague of Singhi Lee's at the University of Michigan, where he's a research professor in the Survey Methodology Program at the Institute for Social Research, the ISR. The institute is entirely funded by what's known as soft money, which means the salaries of the people who work there are funded by the grants and contracts that they're able to obtain.
You can work on whatever projects you want to work on, write whatever proposals you want to bring in, but ultimately you need to support yourself with the grants that you're bringing in, because we don't have that hard line of support from the general university funds to cover all of your salary.
What does it take to apply for a grant from the National Institutes of Health, NIH, or the National Science Foundation? How long a process is this? What's involved? Tell us about it.
Yeah, it's an extremely long process. So really, if you start with a blank piece of paper and you're writing a proposal for the first time, I would say that on average, it takes about a year to craft these research proposals from scratch, doing all the background research, maybe doing some initial preliminary studies to motivate what you want to do, gathering all the prior work that you might have done, trying to sell the research that you're doing. You're writing the proposal for what approaches you want to take, why your science is innovative.
It's a team effort, with research administrators honing the proposal, working on the budget, and making sure the application is formatted correctly.
And then you work with them ultimately to get that submitted through the Office of Research and Sponsored Programs.
So then when it is submitted, then what happens? How is it assessed and how long can that process take?
Yeah, then that proposal, at least at NIH, will get reviewed by 3 experts in your field who are familiar with the topic that you're writing about. And they get together as a panel and they talk about each individual proposal that's been submitted. And then they score that proposal on a number of different dimensions.
The score is based on a number of factors, including the innovation and significance of the proposed research, the overall research environment and direction of the field, and the team involved.
Some proposals don't even get discussed. These are proposals where you don't get a score because it didn't quite cross a threshold.
So you go through this of work.
Yeah, you go through this process, more than a year of work, all your research administrators helping you out, and if the 3 reviewers that you get are unhappy with some aspect of that proposal, it might not even get discussed for potential funding after that entire process.
Even if a proposal does get a score, there can be a lot of back and forth with the NIH, requests to resubmit, reworking, until, if the panel deems it a worthwhile project, you get a yes.
I would say on average, it's about a 2-year process from the time that you initially submit a proposal to the time that you get funded, that you start to actually see the funding come in from that proposal.
Yeah. And then when you do get it, if you're lucky enough, if you're one of those people who gets that email and will call and is like, yeah, I've got it.
Yeah.
They're huge amounts of money, I imagine.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's where, again, like with that money coming in, you said that you would support 3 or 4 faculty colleagues, 3 graduate students, 10 staff members. That's where people who are working at places like ISR, including the students in our graduate programs, they're all elated. Because when you're bringing in these proposals, that means they have a job for another 3 years. And so when you hear about these terminations of research grants, it's not just a particular faculty member who's being affected by that termination. It's an entire team of people that you're hoping to support with this 2-year process of writing a proposal. So it's the lives that are being impacted. It's not just me.
Brady was first aware that something was wrong with one of his own grants in early February, soon after the Trump administration took office.
One of my grants required working in what's called a Federal Research Data Center, or RDC.
RDCs are secure facilities that house restricted use data. This is sensitive personal data collected and managed by federal organizations like the US Census Bureau, or in the case of Brady's research, the National Center for Health Statistics. Access to these facilities requires special authorization from the federal government, which involves a separate application process from the funding application, and researchers must go in person to access this data.
I had to physically walk down to the basement of our building, scan a badge, get in there, triple login access, the whole 9 yards, as we would say.
Brady's study was looking at different ways to measure a person's sexual identity in surveys, and whether that would affect estimates of health disparities between people of different sexual identities.
One of the things that we wanted to do with this particular grant was look at the policy environment in all the different states in the United States in terms of protection against discrimination for sexual minorities. And we wanted to see if poor survey measurement of sexual identity would have a bigger effect on estimates of disparities between these different subgroups in states where there wasn't enough protection in place by policy for sexual minorities. And so looking at that policy information by state required working with restricted access data. So these are not data in the public domain.
Then one day in early February, Brady received a notice by email from the administrators of the federal RDC, the secure room on campus where he went to access the data.
It was literally like a 3-sentence email, just very kind of generic, that said, we're putting a pause on your particular project. Well, I believe the language was the census evaluates the compliance of your project with recent executive orders.
How did you react to getting that?
I just shook my head. I really just shook my head. I had a sense there had been rumors that there were these lists going around of keywords that reviewers were using to determine whether to discuss proposals further or to withdraw proposals from discussion. So there was a list of words that was floating around on social media. You can only take social media so far, and I kind of looked at it and I said, I don't know if that's real or if that's true. But certainly, like, anything having to do with sexual identity, gender identity was all over the place in terms of those words. So I had some concern. And fortunately for me, I was nearing the end of this project. So I'd already been in the RDC for months and months and months, doing the analyses, working on the paper, etc. But I just saw this email and I was just like, honestly, ultimately, the person who directs the RDC at ISR set up a meeting with me in my office and said, Brady, I'm dreading this meeting, but as of today, you've got to stop all the work that you're doing on this research in the RDC because they're not sure it's in compliance with these recent executive orders.
Brady's actual project from the NIH was about to end, and so he never officially got a termination email from the funding agency.
The end of the grant period was like February 28th, and I got this notice in early February. So technically, the grant ended before I would have gotten that kind of direct termination email. But I can almost say with 100% certainty that I would have gotten that direct email at some point, just given the nature of the material.
Did you then start hearing about other people in similar situations to you?
It was just like a waterfall. Basically, any colleagues that were working on anything related to climate change, or anything having to do with vaccination, vaccine hesitancy, anything having to do with sexual identity, gender identity, anything having to do with DE&I, all of the work related to that, you just heard story after story after story after story of these grants being on the spot ended. And again, like when you think about the 2-year process that I was describing, you multiply this by team after team after team after team that were working on these projects. And I think a big misconception is that a lot of people think that an administration chooses to fund these grants based on what they believe are important topics to research. That's not the case. You have your peers in your field who are on these review panels. They're the ones who are scoring this. It's people who are peers conducting research just like you're conducting who are saying, is this stuff novel? Is this stuff going to help move our field along? And they're saying yes. This is important research. It's important science that's going to help advance our knowledge of disparities or help understand how to better treat people or whatever the case may be. That's who's deciding whether or not these proposals are worthy of funding. And that's what's being arbitrarily cut off.
The recent wave of NIH grant terminations isn't only being felt in the US. The NIH's annual budget is $47 billion. The vast majority of that goes to institutions and researchers in the US. But a recent analysis by Nature found 811 grants to international teams in more than 60 countries, worth more than $340 million. In South Africa, where tensions are running high with the new Trump administration over land reform and other diplomatic fault lines, scientists are having their federal research grants suspended too. We spoke to one of them, Glenda Gray, a professor at the Infectious Disease and Oncology Research Institute at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. She's also the Chief Scientific Officer at South Africa's Medical Research Council and is at the forefront of research efforts to find a vaccine for HIV. At the start of this year, most of Glenda's funding came from USAID and the NIH. But then in January, a $46 million project funded by USAID working to discover, test and manufacture HIV vaccines on the African continent was cancelled amid sweeping cuts to the US aid budget. Glenda Gray told me that she then became concerned about funding for the Soweto Clinical Trial Unit, another of her projects funded by a $1.3 million grant from the NIH.
There was, a subliminal fear that started to percolate already at the end of January. And I said to my team then, we need to start looking at our grants. We need to start looking at our exposure. We need to start thinking about making alternative plans.
The NIH grant provides the baseline funding for the Soweto Clinical Trial Unit, the CTU. But the unit is also part of 4 global research networks on HIV/AIDS prevention and treatment strategies. These networks open the door to participation in various clinical trials, which can be worth anything from $100,000 for a small study up to a couple of $100 million for something like a phase 3 study.
It's funded a lot. HIV vaccine efficacy trials, it's HIV prevention trials, it's HIV therapeutic trials, it's treatment for children, it's treatment for adults, it's the cure agenda, it's monoclonal antibodies, it's discovery medicine studies. So it's a whole range of everything from prevention to treatment in everything from pregnant women, newborns to adults, adolescents, and everybody else, from people living with HIV to people not living with HIV.
This was the second 5-year-long grant that the Soweto unit had from the NIH, and they were in year 4 of that second grant.
It's 10 years of funding from the NIH doing this kind of work.
Then in late March, Glenda's team heard that NIH funding for another clinical trial unit, run by her colleagues Professors Ian Sunner and Helen Rees at Wits University, had been suspended.
And so immediately we went onto the website to check the status of our grant, and it's been pending. So my team said it was green, a week prior to that, and it went amber, pending. And it's been amber since then.
When I spoke to her in mid-April, Glenda hadn't yet received any direct communication from the NIH herself. But on the 16th of April, the global networks that the Soweto CTU is affiliated with received an email giving them notice of their grant award for the second half of 2025. One of the networks was told it must reduce spending by 30%.
And there was a note saying that South Africa is excluded from this notice of a grant award. So basically, you can't start new studies in South Africa. You can continue with the follow-up of participants in the studies, but you can't enroll new participants and you can't start new studies. So we've been excluded from the next phase of these network studies.
This is a significant blow for the global research networks, she says.
30% of all the NIH network studies happen in South Africa. And so that's a substantial amount of revenue that goes to the networks to be used in South Africa. So in all intents and purposes, for the next period, South Africa is eliminated from the NIH network's scientific agenda.
At this stage, does it appear to you that all grants in South Africa are simply being targeted?
Well, it seems to, from the information that they gave the networks, they were specifically targeting South Africa, and in the second paragraph, I guess DEI as well.
DEI, but would that in any way relate to your work?
So I guess if you call working in Africa DEI, then yes.
Glenda and her colleagues have lobbied the South African government about the funding cuts and what's at stake, and the government held a meeting in mid-April to discuss the crisis.
But the kind of money that we need, it's irreplaceable. So the NIH funding and the USAID funding that we got for research is going to be irreplaceable from a country level.
Where would you look for other money?
Well, we've been trying. So everyone's been writing grants. We've been speaking to the Gates Foundation, speaking to Wellcome, speaking to our government, looking at public-private partnerships, talking to other philanthropy. There's talk of a solidarity fund, but it's never going to be at the kind of level that will replace the kind of research infrastructure that we've got. So we're going to not be able to fund the amount of science we've done at the level that we had, that we got through the NIH funding, which was a competitive process. Remember, it was not like this is aid or it was doled out to us. We went into a competition with scientists all over the world and we won these grants to do the science.
What does it mean then for the future of research in South Africa? And in particular for trials for HIV vaccines, which is, what you've been championing over many years?
Basically, you lose the knowledge or the value of understanding HIV prevention, HIV vaccines, or therapeutics, because we have the infrastructure, we have the burden of disease, and we have the ability to answer these questions. And so it's going to take much longer to answer these questions than if you had South Africa there. So basically, we slow down HIV vaccine research, we slow down cure, and we slow down other HIV prevention methodologies. We have the critical mass, the infrastructure, and the scientists, and the regulatory and ethical environment to answer these questions. And so basically, you slow down the process of knowledge generation.
I'll end on a personal question if I can. What does it feel like to be a scientist right now in South Africa?
I think that I guess South African scientists are resilient. We've had to weather many storms from AIDS, from the explosion of HIV to AIDS denialism, to watching people die, getting people onto treatment, having vaccine trials that have failed. And so I guess you have to be resilient to be a scientist in this field. And how it feels now is, I guess, we're like deers in the headlight because we don't know how to pivot. We're acutely aware of what we're losing and whether we'll ever be able to bring it back again. And I think it's about the loss of the scientists, the community, the infrastructure, that it's going to be very hard to bring it back to this kind of level again.
Thank you so much for sharing your experiences with us.
Thank you.
Back in the US, scientists like Singhi Lee, whose grants have been terminated, are taking whatever steps they can to appeal that decision. Sunghee's termination email provided an email address she could write to submit an administrative appeal.
I worked on that administrative appeal, but it was extremely challenging because it does not tell you how this will work. I do not know who's reading it, right? And what should be included in the appeal statement, what they're looking for.
Sunghee's appeal was submitted in mid-April, and it would probably take about a month to get a response. She's grateful for the support she's getting from the University of Michigan. The university's administration put together a program of bridge funding where researchers whose grants have been terminated can apply for support.
This whole grant termination and also administrative appeal are really, really foreign concepts. So as long as I believe in the last decade or so, there have been maybe a dozen grants that got terminated by NIH, and they all had to do with research misconduct. So universities do not know how to respond to this termination. So I cannot, hold my university accountable for anything because it's not their fault by any means, right? And luckily, I'm in a university that thought about this possibility with the current administration and had this bridge funding and things like that in place. I cannot imagine what it would have been like if I was at a university without this type of support. Even with this support, it's been extremely difficult.
What's it been like for you personally? I mean, this is something, as you say, you've spent 20 years working up to this grant. It's obviously a huge part of your work and your career. So what's it been like to go through this?
Well, the first week, lots of emotions, up and down, up and down, up and down. And also getting very scared, right? I felt very powerless and helpless. And knowing that my career will be okay, but not necessarily thriving. So I had to have a really soul searching. Is this what I really should be doing? Maybe this is worthless. Maybe I shouldn't be doing this. I should do something else. And I do know that, with the types of work that I do, I can easily pivot and go to like industry. So I had to spend a couple weeks to kind of reconcile, like, what is it that I want to do with this imminent challenge that I have in front of me. But in terms of research, I do firmly believe this particular topic that I'm pursuing has to be addressed in one way or another. So I'm going to pursue this topic no matter what. Might take much longer than I was hoping, right? Some years ago when I wrote this proposal, being able to understand ways to prevent or even delay Alzheimer's disease will be extremely important for financial reasons and also public health reasons, or of course just for humane reasons, right? So that's where I am today. And if you ask me tomorrow, I might say something different.
Well, good luck with your appeal. And do let us know what happens.
Okay. Thank you so much for spending time with me and giving me an opportunity to share my experiences.
There's a lot of looking in the mirror and saying, are these research programs that I've been working so hard on, are they really not worth a whole lot? Or do people really think that lowly of the particular topics that I'm working on?
Singhee's colleague at the University of Michigan, Brady West, told me that many researchers are now having to make hard choices about what to do next.
There's a lot of kind of self-reflection about whether I want to even continue working in academia. Like, is this an environment where I want to continue doing my science? And like the people who are, dedicated, really hardcore, everybody's pivoting. So they're pivoting away from the research that is considered, like, again, verboten, because it's focusing on particular words. And they're saying, what can we write proposals on? What can we work on that's not going to be flagged? So your first thought isn't about the science. Your first thought is, how can I write a proposal that's not going to have certain keywords in it? And that's just not a good way to do science, like, in all honesty. But that's how people are pivoting.
Do you think it's affecting the choices people are really then making on what they're going to do research on?
100%. And the problem is that a lot of this research is on disparities. It's on differences between groups defined by different identities. And a lot of that research trying to understand disparities and really dig into what can be done to eliminate some of those disparities is just going to get ignored. For a couple of years, for a decade, it's going to take a long time to bounce back, and there's going to be an entire body of knowledge in many areas that's just going to get lost in terms of what's going on. And what that means is that certain communities that we're doing this research on are basically going to get ignored.
Well, thank you so much. Appreciate you talking to us.
Oh, yeah, my pleasure. This has been a great conversation, and thank you for inviting me on.
The Conversation approached the National Institutes of Health for comment for this story, but they did not respond. That's it for this week's episode of The Conversation Weekly. We'll pop some links in our show notes to some articles of analysis from The Conversation about the Trump administration's attacks on universities. This episode was written and produced by me, Gemma Ware, and Katie Flood, with sound design and mixing by Eloise Stevens. Our theme music is by Nita Saul. Thanks also for this episode go to Maggie Villiger and Beth Daly at The Conversation US. If you'd like to get in touch with the show, please email us directly at podcast@theconversation.com. You can sign up for The Conversation's free daily newsletter by clicking on the link in our show notes. And finally, The Conversation is a non-profit news outlet dedicated to sharing the work of academic experts to help you make better decisions. If you like what we do, please support us at donate.theconversation.com, and please rate and review the podcast wherever you follow us. It really does help. Thanks very much for listening.